Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Brown. I'm a fourth year philosophy student at the University of Edinburgh and I'm excited to be here today to help facilitate this very important discussion. Before I introduce our panel, I wanted to say a few quick words about what we're here to discuss and what to expect, although Richard has just gone through that. The commitment that the Scottish Government has made to banning conversion practices in all their forms may on its face seem like a good thing, but perhaps it will come as no surprise that this can be misleading. Things aren't always as they seem. Words that have a common and often noble usage have come to mean sometimes the opposite of what springs to mind upon first hearing a term. For example, the word inclusion. While conjuring in most people's mind the idea that we shouldn't exclude people for things they cannot help, this has in some contexts come to mean the very opposite. To exclude that which makes someone from a minority or marginal group feel as if they don't belong, which can include the exclusion of texts, authors, speech, and even people based on things they can't help. Similarly, conversion practice or conversion therapy conjures in the mind inhumane and abusive treatment oriented towards curing homosexuals. Who wouldn't be opposed to this? But when the Scottish and UK governments seek a ban on conversion practices, what exactly do they mean by this? Have we really fallen back to the failures of the past in spite of the immense social improvements that have been made over the last half a century? Has the human proclivity for prejudice found itself a new target? Or are we confronted by a language game implemented by quote-unquote experts that seeks to ensure ideological fealty or an expansion of the reach of government once again into the day-to-day lives of men and women and our children? This is what we're here to discuss today. As was pointed out by Pauline in the promotional video for this event, which you may have seen, every single one of the major parties in Scotland has committed themselves to this ban. If it is the latter circumstance of ideological language and power games that we are confronted with, then there is no opposition to this ban from any of the major parties. The potential for clarity and opposition is here, in this room, in the form of all of you who have come today to engage in this urgent and difficult topic, those of you who may be watching online after the fact of this event, and our panel of speakers, who are Stuart Waiton, on the left here, a sociology and criminology lecturer at the University of Abertay. He's written on antisocial behaviour, academic freedom and free speech, politics beyond left and right, and other topics. He's also a founding member of the Scottish Union for Education. We have next to him Bruce Scott, psychoanalyst and vocal critic of the Scottish schooling system, as well as the use of nudge tactics by the UK, and he's published in outlets like UK Column. We also have John Higgon, on the right here, consultant neuropsychologist and founder of ScotPAG, a group concerned with the understanding and treatment of gender dysphoria and transgender issues. Next to him we have Phil Holden, Deputy Leader of the Scottish Family Party, which campaigns for strong families and family autonomy and to protect basic rights and freedoms from extremism. And finally, we have David Scott, formerly of UK Column, also an engineer, entrepreneur and activist against child abuse. One last thing before I turn you over to our panel of speakers, I wanted to say a quick word about representation. It may be observed by our critics that we have an all-male panel, otherwise known as a manel. However, that's my punchline. However, I would like to point out that we authentically identify as having women on our panel, and if anyone tries to convince us otherwise, you're engaged in conversion practices. Now, I'd like to hand you over to talk about the definition of conversion practices and the difference between the public conception and the expanded definition in the bill. Thank you.
I think intent to suppress or change is quite difficult to define. I think for therapists, there is a difference between talking through an issue with a patient and trying to talk a patient out of a particular characteristic or viewpoint they might have. And I think all therapists would recognise that distinction, but I think it's very difficult to legislate for it and to define exactly what that means in a legal sense. If I could give a kind of hypothetical patient for you to think about, might bring some of these issues to life a bit. Imagine that I am sitting in my office and the phone goes and there's a middle-aged lady on the other end of the phone, Mrs. Worried Parent, and she says to me, my 15-year-old daughter was quite happy until a few months ago, but she's now expressing the idea that she is male. She has a friend who's expressing the same idea. She turns 16 quite soon, and she wishes to go on to puberty blocking medication, and she's talking about surgery. We've been looking around for a therapist. We see lots of therapists who are affirmative, who will help her in her progress towards those aims. But we see very, very few therapists who express any skepticism about these kinds of ideas. But we notice that you are one of those therapists. And we would like you to see our daughter and provide some therapy. So I say, yes, I will do that. I give the usual caveats that the daughter is the client, no matter who's paying, and then it's not my job to tell the daughter how she should behave, but that I'll be happy to discuss these issues with her and try to help her to gain more of a sense of being comfortable in her own body. Now, imagine that goes quite well, and she leaves after a session of, a number of sessions, feeling better in herself. But then a few years later, she comes back to me to tell me that she's gone through the gender reassignment surgery after all, and she's now a male, and she feels that all those years have been wasted. If she'd only had the surgery earlier, she would have been in a better place in retrospect. Now, what do you think has happened there? Have I attempted to suppress her gender identity, or have I offered therapy that's coming from an ethical standpoint? I think the law would have a great difficulty in distinguishing between those two things. So actually, I'm quite supportive of the idea of a ban on conversion practices. I don't really see that it's much of an issue, because I don't see that in mental health there is a huge number of therapists who practice that way anyway. So in principle, I'm supportive, and I do appreciate that the government has attempted to build some safeguards into the legislation, but I'm just not convinced, especially with gender identity, that those safeguards are strong enough to protect ethical therapists from doing their job.
I'm just going to bring Stuart in first, and then we'll come to Phil afterwards.
Yeah, I'm a sociologist, so I probably tend to think about these things too abstractly. But nevertheless, I think what really worries me about this, and in fact most of the laws and the frameworks for what's developing at the minute, is that I think what we're seeing is a redefinition of what it means to be a person, and a collapse of, well, many ways you could think about it. I'm sitting on the far left because historically I'm from the far left, so I thought I would do that, although from your perspective I'm probably on the far right. But anyway, I should have thought about this clearly. So what I mean by that is, classically, what was understood by an individual was that there was a social dimension to an individual. So even in, if you like, John Stuart Mill's idea of being a liberal individual, it was very public, right? So he thought that to be an individual, you should be a public individual. And that was part of his free speech ideal, or idealization, was not an obsession with you can sit in your bedroom having wonderful thoughts, but actually you need to go out in the public realm and speak, because people then need to listen and think and judge and react to that. And what was key and really important to the emergence of that modern individual was the idea that you need to be robust, right? It was a central understanding of what it means to be adult, was that you moved from a fragile self to a robust self, which is why we would tell kids that the sticks and stones thing, sticks and stones might break my bones, but words will never harm me. It's not because words don't harm, because they do, but it was a form of education to say you need to develop strength and a capacity to deal with words. What I find absolutely astonishing about the conversion therapy bill How it would pan out in actual law and practice, God only knows. Because what it's essentially saying is that an adult can't listen to another adult having a conversation, if that conversation is the type that's been described here, which is an assault on the idea of you as a human subject, right? That you can voluntarily go somewhere and have someone have a conversation with you about a subject that is sensitive, difficult, whatever it is. And the implications of that are mind-boggling, right? Absolutely mind-boggling, because what else is harmful? You know, what else might lead to suicidal thoughts, as it's described? I mean, it's endless in terms of the authoritarian implications of it. And I was just looking at the definitions or the discussion in the Scottish Government. What is it? It's everyday conversion therapy practices. So it says, what harm do conversion practices cause? So it says, conversion practices are inherently harmful. They deny people's right to be themselves. Right? And what we're getting at the minute is a redefinition of the self. And it's this, you know, it's about your lived experience and be the real me. And there's this idea now of the authentic self. And the reason these arguments are mad, but appear to carry weight in society, is because we now have a redefinition of the self as an authentic self. And what they mean by that is a self that doesn't have anything coming in from outside. It's a definition of the most purified narcissist that is now becoming normalized and institutionalized, not just in this law, in general, right? That is now what is understood in terms of harm, in terms of what it means to be an individual, what it means to be, how we understand violence, and so on. It's, in sociology, it's called the unencumbered self, right? The self that literally has nothing outside of it that helps determine what it is. Historically, that was understood to be the adolescent, right? Because you had the understanding of an adolescent was you have an adolescent, and the way an adolescent, the way a human grows, is in the relationship between the self and society. Right? And what happens is, to become an adult, you need to stop being an adolescent, because you then become part of society. And what is being redefined as the correct nature of a human today is the adolescent narcissistic self. Right? And that's been institutionalized and brought in through law, which is utterly horrifying, and it's absolutely infantilizing, right? As well as being an assault on beliefs and values. And that's why Christianity, you know, all sorts of belief systems are now seen with horror, because they by their very nature, they are oppressive on this unencumbered self. Right? So it's an assault on values, it's an assault on belief, it's an assault on society, it's an assault on norms, and it's an assault on the individual. Right? And that is what is happening in culture, and it is horrifying.
So one of the best definitions of conversion therapy I heard, this may not be an exact quote, but it went something like this. Banning somebody saying something with which I disagree. And that came from the gay comedian Andrew Doyle. So he's somebody who defends freedom of speech. And as somebody who's gay, he hates what this law is doing. And in Scotland, we might add that it's banning somebody saying something with which I disagree at least twice, because that's the threshold in Scotland. I come at this from a couple of angles. So one is from the Scottish Family Party, and the Scottish Family Party is a secular party. So, you know, when I've got my Scottish Family Party hat on, I can only speak from a secular perspective. But I've also been an elder in a church and active in sharing my faith. So the original definition that was proposed by the working group was this. It says, the group recommends that the definition of conversion practices must apply equally to sexual orientation, expression of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression of gender identity, and must be wide enough to encompass any treatment, practice, or effort that aims to change, suppress, and or eliminate a person's sexual orientation, expression of sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression. And so, you know, that shows you the intent of the committee, was that it's anything at all which limits somebody's sexual expression, you know, which related to their sexual orientation. And so that's something that goes like both for heterosexuals and homosexuals. And so as a Christian, like a pastor might even have trouble like talking to somebody who's you know, struggling and feeling tempted to have an affair, and they go to the pastor and they say, well, what should I do? You know, and the pastor will be, you know, well, what can I say? Basically, you're expressing your heterosexuality by having an affair with somebody who is not your wife. And I think, you know, one of the things that this, for me, is, in the Bible it says, don't allow what you know to be good to be spoken of as evil. And for me, this thing of conversion therapy is not actually something which is just purely academic. When I was at school, this was a long time before the internet, but we were at the forefront of technology. We had our computers, and there were kind of pornography discs that started to be distributed within the school. This was not kind of 50 Shades of Grey at that time. This was like 4 Shades of Grey, but as well, it was, you know, it was very graphic, kind of video captured content. And for me, that had an effect on me, because you were actually, you know, watching people in the act of having sex. And I think for me, that resulted in me being stimulated both by male and female images. And I viewed myself as an atheist until I went to university, ended up in a flat with 3 people who were Christians, and I argued with them and said, you can't be Christians and be scientists. You know, science disproved the God Bible. And they gave me good answers to my scientific questions. And that caused me to look at the moral questions in the Bible and to ask, you know, is what this book's saying any good? And that resulted in me becoming convicted of my sin. And what had happened in my life was that my sexual desire had become stronger than my will, basically, in kind of both directions. And I wasn't very popular, so I didn't have any chance to act out any of those desires. But I could see that what the Bible said was true, that whoever sins is a slave to sin, and they have a continual lust for more and more. And it kind of worried me what would happen with the trajectory that my life was on. And when I became even like about 49% thinking like God might be real, I prayed and said, God, I'm not fit to be in control of my life. You know, if you're real, you need to help me. Now, I think I was maybe hoping that there would be some blinding light that filled the room, like the Apostle Paul, you know, on the road to Damascus, but nothing happened. But what happened about, you know, 3 weeks later, when I was about to maybe pray the same prayer, I realized that everything had changed, that desires that before were so strong, there was now something inside me that was able to resist those things. And so in my own experience, I've seen a change within my sexuality. And so when I see people saying that change is impossible and that this is evil, then I know I know for myself that just isn't true. This is something that C.S. Lewis said. He said, the right to happiness is chiefly claimed for the sexual impulse. It seems to me impossible that the matter should stay there. The fatal principle, once allowed in that department, must sooner or later seep through our whole lives. We thus advance towards a state of society in which not only each man, but every impulse in each man claims carte blanche. And then, though our technological skill may help us survive a little longer, our civilization will have died at heart. And one dare not even add, unfortunately, be swept away.
Let's start with Kate Forbes. Kate Forbes was senior in the Scottish National Party. She was finance minister in Scotland, and she's famously a member of the Free Church of Scotland and a Christian. And she said, conversion therapy is abhorrent. That's the word she used. That's inspiring, disgust, loathing, repugnant. That's the word she used, because that's the word she had to use politically. That's the word that was placed in her mouth, because this is about political control. She had to say that in order to be permitted to have a career. She did not do what she had to do as a Christian, as a thinking human being, which is speak the truth and take what's coming, because it's better to be on the side of truth than it is to be on the side of lies, whatever the short-term career consequences. So let me tell you a story. This is not a theoretical one, a hypothetical one. This is real. So there was a girl, and she was a teenager, and she was unhappy. And she went along and she described her unhappiness, and she was told that the problem was she was actually a boy in a woman's body. And she was put on puberty blockers. And then she was put on a track to surgery. And she came out of her unhappiness and realised what happened to her in her early 20s, by which point she was sterile because she'd had a hysterectomy and she had her breasts cut off, and she regretted it all bitterly. And she tried to get the word out. And Kemi Badenoch, who was responsible for this down in Westminster, heard about her speaking and talking about her experiences, and tried to reach out and speak to this woman. And she was blocked by her own civil service, who were activists engaged in political change of the country. They did not want this woman's voice to be heard. What Kate Forbes is saying is that you don't want that woman's voice to be heard. What this legislation is saying is if a therapist had helped her and saved her from the misery she is now in, that therapist would be committing a crime that could see him or her spend 7 years in prison and be subject to an unlimited fine. That, ladies and gentlemen, and yes, I did just assume your genders, is evil. And that's what we're up against. And it's based on a series of lies. And it's the lies that make it weak, because it's not based on anything real. And the way to overcome it, and we'll talk about this later, is to deal first with the lies. One of the underpinning lies is you can't change your sexuality. And we've heard several stories today that show that's not true. I'm going to give you just one more. This is Rosaria's story. Rosaria Butterfield was the ultimate left-wing, firebrand, lesbian academic. She was working at Syracuse University. She specialised in queer theory. She was living a lesbian lifestyle, and she was very happy in the academic and intellectual world in which she lived. But she didn't like, she was very hostile towards the far right and the Christians, and she wanted to take the fight to them intellectually. And there was a group called the Promise Keepers came to town, so she wrote a letter to the local newspaper saying how awful it was that these far-right Christian extremists were allowed in her town. And the response to the letter was sometimes supportive, sometimes hostile, and she had 2 boxes on her desk, one for abusive hate mail and one for supportive mail. And the one letter came in that she couldn't decide which box to put it in, and it was from a Christian pastor. So eventually, when this letter was still on her desk 2 weeks later, she contacted the pastor and invited her round for tea. And she thought, excellent. I'm doing a research paper on the nasty, evil, far-right Christians, and this man is going to be my research tool, and he doesn't even know it. So she'd engaged with him and started a conversation with him. This involved looking at what the Bible said and studying what the Bible said and debating it with him. And she started from a very, very hostile position. But there was dialogue. And he was nice to her. And he had her round. And he gave her tea. And he didn't say words of condemnation. He just simply stated what he believed was true. And so did she. And the upshot was 2 years later, she became a Christian. And sometime after that, she became the wife of a pastor. And she now talks and writes beautifully about how people are transformed by God, by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And she points out that the solution to homosexuality is not heterosexuality, because there's as much evil and harm in that world as in any other. She points out the solution is holiness, and she speaks very beautifully about this. So people can change, and the government is lying to you when they say this is not possible. I'll just finish with, since we're on the Christian theme, a quick quote. Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. That is going to be criminalised by the Scottish government if they get away with it, but they will not, because their answers, their position, their policies are based on lies, and the lies will not stand. Thank you.
What I've been hearing from everyone that's spoken so far is that the government is trying to clamp down on some things that they claim can't change, but that they absolutely can. You've spoken about, just there, David, about an attempt to change the political nature of this country, and that the government is lying. You brought up queer theory. I wonder if yourself or anyone else on the panel has anything to say about the nature of this political change. Why are they lying? What is it that they're lying about? What are they trying to achieve in lying in this use of language? Yes, Stuart, please. Yeah, did you gesture?
I was going to answer your question.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, go. Yeah, so that little thing I read you before was part 30, paragraph 35 of this background check. Part 36 says, because I don't think they are lying, right? Because if I'm right, that the nature of what it means to be human today is now being changed, then they're relating to the nature of being human. They're not lying, but they might. That's not to say they won't lie occasionally, but that's not the essence of the problem. To part 36, it says, the impact on conversion practices on people can be lifelong. Often the harm is not immediately apparent. People who have experienced conversion practices have reported severe mental health consequences, including suicidalization, depression, and anxiety. And 37 says research from Australia has found complex form of post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. And again, it's a wider problem of the creation of a therapeutic culture, which is well beyond conversion therapy, and it's something that almost all of us are part of. So if your child hasn't been given a diagnosis yet, then they will have soon, or your grandchild. I know it sounds funny, but I think 37%, although I have to look into, I do actually, someone sent me a file on this today and I haven't looked at it yet, but 37% of Scottish school children have additional support needs. Right? Now, I don't know how many of them are mental health related, but I suspect quite a lot of them. In 10 years' time, that'll probably be about 50%, and in 20 years' time, who knows? So the way societies change and operates, the way we change and operate, and the way the culture changes and operates is becoming increasingly therapeutic, so that everything is understood almost internally in terms of our mental well-being and how we think about ourselves. You know, even sport, almost any activity now, as they'll say, it's good for your mental well-being, right? Not it's good, right? It's good for your mental well-being. Anything and everything is good for your mental well-being. And we think about this. You know, if we go for a run, we think, oh, it'll be good for my mental health, right? It'll be good for that. So everything is becoming internalized. But the point about this, and you can see this, right? So if you use, there's this great search engine on Google, it's the best thing. I use it all the time. I keep telling my students about it. I've yet to see a single student write an essay that uses it, unfortunately. So I don't know. I'm talking to the wall clearly, but it's called Google Ngrams. And it gives you a search engine of all the books on Google, which is like 25 million, like that, in a second. And by the end, they'll have every book that's ever been written on Google. So all the evils of Google, at least we have Google Ngrams. And you can look up words like traumatized, right? And you'll notice that this word was hardly ever used until in the last 30 years, and then suddenly it goes through the roof, right? And you can use all the therapeutic terms. And these terms we now just say, right? So kids will just say, oh, it's traumatizing, right? Almost everything we watch on Netflix becomes about an internal dialogue of how this has traumatized the police officer, how it's traumatized a woman who's experienced rape or been this, or even much more minor instances. And it's just presumed that that is trauma. And the Scottish Government has a trauma-informed toolkit, and the framework of this is that every single professional in Scotland needs to be trained to be trauma-informed and presume that every client and every person they come across will be potentially or arguably traumatized because of the experience that they have. We all have adverse experiences, and that leads to trauma. So every single worker, doctor, nurse, police, teacher, everyone needs to be trauma-informed, right? And this is what they are engaging with, is the vulnerable self, right? And I would, if I was going to, I say this, I'll probably say something else tomorrow, but if I was going to say what is the purpose of the modern elites, I would say it is to protect the vulnerable, right? That is what they see as their job, protecting the vulnerable. So you get categories of vulnerable groups, for example, right? Which is why certain groups in terms of gay, if you're gay, if you're black, if you're a woman, if you're disabled, if you're elderly now, you are part of a vulnerable group. So I think part of the conversion therapy framework is the protection of vulnerable groups as they see it. They see that as their moral duty. That's how they understand the individual. And that is how institutions are now developing, how they relate to children, the elderly, disabled, gay. Just about everybody is categorized through this idea of protecting the vulnerable. So none of this is a lie, right? This is their belief system, right? This is their understanding of morality, right? So that in terms of schools, and why is it that head teachers are going along with this? Why are teachers going along with it? Why are psychotherapists going along with it? All of this, it's because it's a new morality. And it's a new morality of protection, where you understand the individual as being essentially vulnerable, and your job is to protect them. That's why it's so difficult. Right? That's why it can carry, right? Because as a parent who doesn't have a clue why this is going on, you feel like a total bastard to challenge this, right? Because what you're saying, what about the suicidal thoughts? What about the bullying? What about, it's all categorized in a framework where they're protecting vulnerable people as understood, and you look like a total scumbag for questioning this. So it's actually very, very difficult, and just to say it's lies or whatever isn't going to work, because this is embedded in every institution, every profession, and in our culture. And it's embedded in us to a certain extent, because we've been in a therapeutic culture now for at least 30 years, as far as I can see, and it's part of our very culture.
Thank you.
So I'd like to speak to something of what the lie is and how clear it is that it's a lie. And we can see this that when we look at the statistics. So there's a company called 23andMe that sequences people's genomes. And a large shareholder in that is Google. And this is one of their headlines. It says, massive study finds no single genetic cause of same-sex sexual behavior. This was in Scientific American. The study of 477,000 participants by 23andMe showed that somewhere between 75 and 92% of what contributes to sexual orientation is not genetic. So somewhere between 75 and 92% is not based on genes. These are the things that we see in generational studies. So 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBT compared to 4% of boomers. That's Ipsos Murray poll, so a 500% increase from the boomers to the Gen Z. This is one from Gallup, and this is going from the traditionalist to Gen Z. It says that 19.7% of Gen Z identify as LGBT compared to 1.7% of those born before 1946. So that's an 1,100% increase in kind of our living memory. Brown University, their student newspaper, recently had an article saying that 38% of Brown University students identify as LGBT. There was a survey in YouGov which was asking people if they viewed themselves as homosexual, heterosexual, or somewhere in between. And it gave them a scale of, I think it might be like 1 to 6 or 1 to 9 or something like that. And in that, only 50% of the youngest generation saw themselves as entirely heterosexual. And when you looked at the older generations, then again, you saw that was a tiny percentage of people. So we're seeing that something is changing sexuality, within our culture. And it seems clear to me that what's changing it, in quite a large way is that we're promoting these things. We're promoting these things in school. I'm a dad, and I can't move for the things which, the school is sending home to me. Like the school sent home bedtime reading for my child, and it had 2 lesbian women naked, showing their breasts, lying on top of each other. And this was recommended reading for my child, to like read her as a bedtime story. And so my child was, I guess, 10 at the time. So these things are being promoted within schools as well. Outside of the schools say we have to do it because of the pornography and things like that the children are going to see the pornography, so we need to get ahead of the pornography and make sure that absolutely everyone, gets to see these things. And for me, as to the why of it, I think that I can't answer that except from a spiritual perspective. That for me, I think it's something which is evil. It's something which is morally not good. And when you look at conversion therapy, what it's basically saying is that we're allowed to push in one direction. We're allowed to send this material to your children. We're allowed to have it in all of the lessons and things like that and push it to your children. But the moment that you push in the other direction, 7 years in prison for you, unlimited fine for you. Be silent, be quiet. Let us keep pushing in that direction. And the deal which is being made is basically the gospel, as far as Christians say, is repent. You need to turn away from your sin. And conversion therapy says, here is something that you cannot repent of. And the stats by YouGov are saying that that's 50% of our young people. And so for me, what's happening there is basically the enemy is saying, I'd like 50% of the people, you can have 50% of the people, can we make a deal on that? And I think that's the evil which is there.
Bring in John and then Bruce before we finish for break.
Just like to make a couple of points. One is I'm a bit of a naive optimist, and I think the Scottish Government is probably quite well intentioned, thinks it's doing the right thing in trying to protect the rights of minorities, and I kind of stand behind that myself. But I think particularly with gender identity, they've made a mistake because it's so poorly defined and so difficult to define, and also so changeable over the life course that they're on a hiding to nothing trying to include gender identity along with sexual orientation. And the second point I'd like to make briefly, I'm an atheist and a liberal, and I appreciate everybody has their own views on this, but for me, I don't see anything sinful in being gay or being lesbian. I know lots of people have religious beliefs about that, which is up to them, but I just felt something I wanted to say.
Thank you. And Bruce? Yes. We'll finish the break like one.
Yes, very troubling. This idea of queer theory has been mentioned, and it's integral to what we've been talking about, especially what Phil was just saying. If anyone's got a good memory, they might remember the No Outsiders project in Birmingham, where the Muslims and the Muslims, Jewish, some Christians were protesting against the sex education LGBT curriculum in the school. It was based on a government-funded study called Interrogating Heteronormativity in Primary Schools. And the primary objective, this is what queer theory is. It is the addressing of the lack of discussion within school context of childhood sexualities. Now, if that's not an alarm bell to people, it should be. And it goes on, the roots of queer theory, actually discussed in this book and in the research which was based on the Outsiders project, is that they discussed how queer theory in interrogating heteronormativity is against human reproduction, ultimately, the ideology of it. So this idea, and it's very relevant to the Scottish Family Party, who are all for families. They're against families. They want to promote a world where sex is seen as a hobby. Pornography is talked about in schools and discussed. Pornography is extremely harmful. And this issue was I wrote a couple of articles a few years ago about this, and a GP got in touch with me from a GP practice in Scotland, and they were very close to a school which was a big LGBT orientated school. Very a lot of prominent activist teachers were in the school, and she was extremely concerned with the amount of young people coming along, especially young women, believing they were in the wrong body. And her and the other GPs in the practice were, they realised that this was coming from this school. And they were frightened to speak out. So there is a chilling effect in different institutions outside the context of where these things are taking place. And in regard to what Stuart says, this cult of self-esteem or the cult of the self is again prevalent in our therapeutic orientated culture. A little story in Genesis that Moses, when he went to the burning bush, he spoke to God, and God was saying, right, you've got to lead the people out of Egypt, the people of Israel. And he was a bit concerned that he wasn't up for the job. He wasn't able. He was concerned that he wasn't very good. God said to him, I will be with you. That was it. There was no course of CBT offered. There was no person-centered counselling. you know. There was no like group therapy where they talk about emotions and how to bolster a positive self-image. Nothing like that. This, I will be with you. And, you know, it might seem a bit jocular, but there is something of the theological, philosophical that's getting lost in this, alongside the degradation of what's going on in our society. And this culture of this polymorphous perversity that's been pushed in schools through the sex education and LGBT, and the psychologization of people's minds, problem like making the child's minds a problem, their emotions a problem, is a very sinister thing, I think. Much deeper than we'll probably get into today.
Very briefly, to those who are coming at this from a liberal democratic point of view, perhaps rather than a Christian one, I wanted to address whether the Scottish Government are operating in good faith and with good intentions. This is from Aidan O'Brien QC's legal opinion on the proposed legislation. He writes, "The proposals have serious consequences for individuals subject to the law, but they emanate from a government which appears to have forgotten its duty to take seriously its obligations to maintain the conditions of and for a liberal democracy, preferring instead to impose, by virtue of its possession of a monopoly on legitimate violence, its own vision of the good life."
Welcome back, everybody. So for the next half an hour, the panel is going to talk to you about, given everything that we've discussed, what to do looking forward. We're going to give each of them 6 minutes each to give you an assessment of where we should go from here. So we'll start with John on this side.
Okay, I haven't had time to think this through, so this is a little bit off the top of my head. What should we do going forward? I think I have worked in the NHS for 35 years before retiring, and I'm not saying that everything is perfect in the NHS, but I think the overall culture is not one in which you would expect conversion practices to be taking place. If a patient turned up to see a psychologist like myself or any other member of a mental health team, I don't think they would be exposed to the kinds of practices that the Scottish Government is talking about. And presumably the NHS is the biggest provider of mental health services in Scotland and the UK. In private practice, I have some knowledge of private practice as well, and the training courses that are out there, again, they're very keen on inclusion and diversity, and it's hard to imagine that somebody's going to come out of a training course like that and be very keen to promote conversion practices. That's my impression. Now, there may be people out there who have had different experiences, but I think there would be the exception rather than the rule. That's what I would say. So how do we go forward? I think I mentioned earlier that it's very difficult to distinguish between talking through an issue and trying to talk somebody out of a particular course of action. Easy to understand that as a therapist, but very difficult to legislate for it. I'd be inclined to remove therapists from this legislation altogether and to rely on their professional bodies and the regulatory bodies to decide these issues, because I think that leaving it to the law is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, really, and I think it's probably not the best way forward. I'm not sure that I have much more to say on that for now, but I'll come back if anybody has any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I'll stand in line.
Yeah, so for me, every party in the Scottish Parliament supports the conversion therapy ban and has it in their manifesto. And so if you want to see a change, you have to vote for a party that isn't currently in the Scottish Parliament. And that's where the Scottish Family Party comes in, that we're a party that stands for traditional family values. And we reject gender ideology. You know, that every other party kind of accepts the premise that a man can become a woman in some kind of way. But for us, we think that they can't. We'd agree that some people have gender dysphoria, that some people have conditions where they might think they're the opposite gender to their actual sex, but we wouldn't accept that makes them, a member of the opposite sex, or that other people should accept that identity, or that it should be promoted within schools or any of these kind of things. And so, we'd see ourselves as the party which is trying to uproot this ideology. And I think if you accept the ideology, then it has to come along with rights. And the only way to say that there aren't, these rights there is to say that the ideology itself is wrong. And there's many other cases where people, will believe something that's not true, in terms of health conditions and things like that, and it's not our obligation to go along with those. On our table, we've got resources and things like that. So I spoke about how for myself, kind of, it was pornography distributed in the school, which is a big problem for me, but now it's the schools distributing that pornography. This is Corrupting Young Minds. It's a book on the table. It talks about what's being taught in the schools. And I think that combating some of these things is really important, because that's, I think, one of the reasons why many people are having these issues. Also, as a Christian, like, one of the reasons I joined the Scottish Family Party was because I saw that the church itself wasn't engaged in these issues. So here's an issue that basically says that you're not going to be free to preach the gospel in Scotland, which, it's been hundreds of years since it's been the case, that, with the times of the Covenanters and things like that. And now this is kind of creeping up on us, and not many people are speaking out. And I found that the Scottish Family Party is a vehicle on which I can speak out on some issues that I care very, very deeply about. And I'd encourage people who want to speak out on these issues to join the party, because it's a great platform for doing that. And we'd really encourage people that are articulate to come and to join that as well. That as a party, we can't choose who supports us. Anybody can support us, but we really want to see people who maybe have a calling to speak out and to make a good argument on these cases, to come to join us. Very important election time. That if you see what happened with maybe like the UKIP, they never got anybody into the parliament, but just by standing as a party, they were able to secure the referendum. And I'm not making any comments about whether that was a good or a bad thing, but it basically forced the Conservatives into a position where they had to change what they were doing. And you may think, oh, what chance does the Scottish Family Party have? Simply by standing and taking votes away from the Conservatives or from other parties, then it makes an impact on what their policies are.
I was talking before about some of the lies that's been told, and Stuart decided to contradict me because he's Stuart. And he said, oh, you can't just say it's lies, it's about an ideology, and you really believe this. Now, it is both. Both of these things are true. There's deception, there's lies, but they do believe it, and it is an ideology. In terms of how to go about fighting this, there are two lines of defence that the government have. Line number one is this very thin crust of their line, right? So they'll say certain things like no one can change their sexuality. That's not true. They'll say that all attempts to change are harmful. That's not true either. Let me give you an example of what they're not telling you. There is a paper which was based on a 7-year-long study called A Longitudinal Study of Attempted Religiously Mediated Sexual Orientation Change by Jones and Yarhouse. Right, this was published in a peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy. This is a very relevant paper to all of this, and it's not mentioned in the government's review of the facts. It's not mentioned at all because in conclusion they say, the findings of this study appear to contradict the commonly expressed view that sexual orientation is not changeable, and the attempt to change is highly likely to result in harm for those who make such an attempt. So factual information, well-researched information is out there and the government is hiding it, and they are manipulating such evidence as they have to suit their ideological and political objectives. So one aspect of this is we show the lies, we show the manipulations, and we win the intellectual argument. And the other half of this is we do what Stuart wants to do, which is go after the ideology and the redefinition of what it is to be human, and go into the deep underpinnings of what they believe, because ultimately this is a new religion. This is a replacement for Christianity. It sees Christianity as its opposition, and it wants to change the world in particular ways which are, I would argue, extremely harmful. So we go after both the lies and we go after the ideology. Once we've won the intellectual battle, and that is definitely winnable, right, the government's line too is to call us all lots of names. You know you're winning when you start to be called homophobe, transphobe. You fill in the rest. You know what will happen. They will call you names. That means they have no more justification for their beliefs. And then beyond that, there is nothing. We found this out during the No to Name Person campaign. Once the intellectual argument is won, there's a lot of name calling, and that relies on your reaction. If the reaction is to recoil from the name calling and run away, they win. If the reaction is to call them names back and get aggressive, they win. If the reaction is to smile sweetly and say, yeah, none of that's true, can we go back to the matter at hand, please? You win. Right? They require your reaction for the name calling to work, and if you don't give it to them, they have nothing else. So the legislation is extremely poor. It's based on manipulation and deception. The intellectual argument can be won, and the strength can be found to stand up to the name calling and bitterness that will follow, and after that we win.
Well, ways forward. Is it ways forward? This section, is it?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I haven't got any. Thing is, conversion therapy it is a big no-no, as in electric shock, chemical castration. I mean, years ago when I was doing my psychology undergrad, I wrote an essay on some of the treatments that were available way back in the 50s, 60s, etc. And thankfully, those kind of barbaric things are a relic of the past. It just shows you how barbaric human beings can be. But this legislation's in a different scale. As it says, it's been defined as practice, conversation. Back to the psychotherapy idea. It's a big no-no to offer something like I'll offer a treatment which will change your sexuality. But I would go further and also say that it's unethical to offer something to convert one from one's mental ill health into mental health. It's an ethical nightmare, because we're living in this world now where it's all about evidence-based, etc., and promises, and the science, and what goes along with this kind of therapeutic ideology is that everything's we've got to be nice and gentle and treat you nicely and believe everything you say, and therapy, as in the psychotherapy, is not really like that. Emmanuel Levinas, the French-Lithuanian philosopher, is dead now, but his ideas on this, as in, he would see psychotherapy as ethics, You know, someone comes to see you, another person, and there's an idea of a non-totalization of the other idea. You know, you can never know what's going on, and how can you judge? If someone's complaining about a complaint, why suppress it? Why avoid talking about it? Why, you know, I mean, as therapists, people come to therapists, and the therapist may not agree with the lifestyle of a person who comes to see them. But that's not a bad thing, you know. It's up to the person at the end of the day how they want to live. That should be the ethics of any therapist. So if someone comes along and says, "Oh, I'm gay and I enjoy my gay lifestyle and I want to be, but can you change me?" And it's like, well, you know, no, you know, it's an ethical no. But Lev Shestov, the Russian philosopher, said something very interesting. He talked about philosophy in terms of, in a lot of the Eastern European psychotherapists use Lev Shestov as to inform their work, is the idea that philosophy or therapy as ethics is not a comfortable thing. It's an uncomfortable thing. The very ground of one's being that one walks on or exists within is shaken in true psychotherapy or in a true route of inquiry and conversation. So uncomfortable conversations do occur. And this is where a lot of the regulatory frameworks and a lot of the organisations pushing a kind of mental healthism and let's make everyone's life happy and nice is again a kind of fantasy that exists, and it comes out. As I said, a lot of these organisations like the HCPC, which regulates psychologists, or the British Psychological Society, or the UKCP, or the BACP, all these different or professional standards authorities, they stay silent on so many issues which are unethical, i.e. the use of applied psychology over the last 4 years, where people have been harmed, you know, and it has historical precedent, you know, in the East German Stasi regime, when the wall came down and it was revealed that the use of applied psychology and nudging, very similar to what was used during COVID and what's being used now in the climate. Human rights organisations and European psychotherapy organisations deemed that this should never happen again. See, the problem with regulation is, especially when they try to regulate psychotherapy, as has been shown in research looking at increased regulation in medicine, it results in poor care, defensive practice, increased mental health issues for practitioners. This has been shown, for example, the regulation, the Healthcare Professions Council, there was a case a while ago. A psychologist had been reported by another psychologist to the HCPC, which is the psychologist regulator, because the psychologist had a discussion with the patient about their family and their upbringing. But the patient was meant to be getting CBT. So there's thousands and thousands of pounds wasted on a fitness to practice hearing for a psychologist having the common sense to listen to someone's troubles on their upbringing. But that was deemed, a fitness to practice issue. The big problem with this, the current legislation we were here today to discuss, is that it was based on self-report methodology, and it's quite clear within the results of what was thrown up by this self-report survey was that the big culprit who offer conversion practices are faith organisations. 50-odd% roughly from the survey of respondents. And the next people down was, who was offering this, was parents, nearly 30%. So 80%, more than 85% of the culprits of this dangerous practice is faith organisations and families. You've got to wonder what was offered. When it says who offered the therapy, they say the healthcare provider or medical professional offered it. Well, I don't know who would offer it, as in they may question a person's sexual lifestyle and whether it's giving them fulfilment or not. But there's serious questions to be asked about the methodology of the so-called prevalence of it.
I thought that was useful because I do think I don't want it to come across that I hate all therapists, only some, and it's not that this is an assault on therapy from my perspective. It's my problem with therapy culture, which is different, which I'll say a little bit about. I haven't mentioned so far, but I think it's quite significant that I think part of the conversion therapy bill proposal is an assault on families. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes as evidence of this. So this is the Ending Conversion Practices in Scotland, the Scottish Government consultation, their main document. On page 15, it says, what does this mean in practice? As in, what does conversion therapy mean in practice? Point 45. This is where they try and explain that the conversion therapy bill is not an assault on parents. Right? Because they insist absolutely it's not an assault on parents. And this is what they say. Conversion practices must have an intention that another person's sexual orientation or gender identity will be changed or suppressed. This means that the legislation will not apply to a situation where a person is providing advice, guidance, or support for an individual to explore their thoughts, feelings, and options, or for these to be questioned. It goes on. It does not include, as in the conversion therapy bill, would not include an attack on non-directive and ethical guidance and support to a person who might be questioning their sexual orientation. So I'll read that sentence again, because this for me is one of the most significant sentences I've come across in a government document. So what they're saying is what will not be criminalised is non-directive and ethical guidance from a parent. Right? That's a therapist, not a parent. Non-directive and ethical guidance. Right? That means you can have no values, you can have no beliefs, you can have no authority. You must be a therapist as a parent. And if you are a therapist, if you are non-directive in your conversation with your 10-year-old child, right? If you're non-directive, then you'll not be criminalised. If you are directive, right? In other words, if you're human, if you have beliefs and judgment and values, you are a criminal, right? That's what that is saying, right? That is their attempt to say we are not criminalising parents. So it's fine if you're a therapist, but if you're an actual parent with any values and beliefs at all, then you're a criminal. Right? So that's supposedly their defence. This is another quote. This is from the Human Rights Bill for Scotland consultation, June 2023, page 25. And this is discussing how human rights and children's rights in Scotland should be embedded in law. And this is a quote, which they put in bold, from a member of the Lived Experienced Board. And it says this. So this is about if children's rights and human rights were incorporated in the Scottish law, it would impact the young people of Scotland in the long term as we would grow to unlearn the prejudice taught to us by the older generations who did not have these rights in place. Right? So the human rights and children's rights being incorporated in Scottish law would mean that young people unlearn the prejudices taught to them by older generations. So what's happening here is, as the government often says, the government is trying to change the culture, right, which is a term they often use. Someone should point out to the Scottish government that it is not their job to change the culture, it is their job to reflect the culture. Right? They are there as our representatives, but they do not see themselves as our representatives. They are very clear that they are a new elite and we are the deplorables. And we will have our culture changed. And they will change it through children. And a colleague of mine who's speaking at the event on Saturday, Alka, had a discussion, open discussion, public discussion with someone who promotes various views on how education should be about social justice and so on, not about education. And Alka said in public to this person, but what you're talking about is politics. Right? That's politics, which is not the job of schools, and it's not something that should relate to children. And this person said, without any embarrassment, it is politics. The problem with politics is it's too slow. Right? It's too slow because you have to actually convince people, actual human subjects, adults, about whether you're right or wrong. It's too slow, therefore we need to incorporate social justice into schools. Now that's just social engineering, pure and simple and unembarrassed, saying that. So what do I think we can do to change it? Well, in the perhaps not in the short term, but the short term, medium term and long term, the reason I set up this Scottish Union for Education is because I think society needs new institutions. It needs new political parties and it needs new institutions. So we are trying to establish a new institution, a new union for teachers and most importantly in this discussion, for parents. Because I think parents have got huge power, but they don't feel they have huge power because we're all individualized now and we're not in a collective group. But I think if we could have a mass collective organization with parents in it who reflect all sorts of values and beliefs, but at least have values and beliefs, then I think we have a genuine chance of having a weight and a body of people who can counter the shift that's taking place.
And just before we go to the Q&A, we'll just hear from David very quickly.
Again, to the issue of the effect on the family that Stuart raised there. Been doing a little writing on this recently, and I came across a quote from the father of English family law, Stephen Cretney, who said, almost every piece of family legislation in the past century has actually worked out in a way radically different from the policy presented to the legislature as justifying the legislation in question, and has often had results quite different from those which the initiators intended. And if that's true of the legislation we've had in the past century coming out of Westminster, it's all the more true of badly written, badly conceived legislation of the type we're talking about today. Just to finish, I also wrote a little paper on the child guidance movement. I started off by saying there's a theme in the work of the state that goes back over a century, and it is this: children won't do as they are, and parents are to blame. The state will save the little ones from the subversive influence of their families and make of them new creatures, better than before and heading towards perfection. And I believe that is how it's viewed. In that paper, I quoted the Supreme Court, Stuart will know all about this, in their findings on the named person action taken by the Christian Institute and others. The Supreme Court said, individual differences are the product of the interplay between the individual person and his upbringing and environment. Different upbringings produce different people. The first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is to get at the children, to distance them from the subversive varied influences of their families and indoctrinate them in the ruler's view of the world. Within limits, families must be left to bring up the children in their own way. And I summarised that with a quote from Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, who said, "The act of founding the family, I repeat, is an individual adventure outside the frontiers of the state, and if I could have that carved into the front pavement in front of Holyrood, I would do so." Thank you.